Well, good morning and welcome to Grace Church on the Hill for our Christian Education Hour. We are delighted you can join us. I'm joined by Canon Peter Walker. And we're celebrating Epiphany a little bit late this year. We've transferred it from this past Wednesday, but we thought it'd be a good time to take a look at one of the classic works of art about this day. T.S. Eliot's Journey of the Magi. It's a pretty short poem, and we're lucky enough to have the author himself available in recording, of course, to read it for us. So Chris is going to play a recording of T.S. Eliot reading his poem, Journey of the Magi.
A cold coming we had of it, just the worst time of the year for a journey, and such a long journey, the ways deep and the weather sharp, the very dead of winter. And the camels, galled, sore-footed, refractory, lying down in the melting snow. There were times we regretted the summer palaces on slopes, the terraces, and the silken girls bringing sherbet. Then the camel men cursing and grumbling, and running away and wanting their liquor and women, and the night fires going out, and the lack of shelters, and the cities hostile, and the towns unfriendly, and the villages dirty, and charging high prices. A hard time we had of it. At the end we preferred to travel all night, sleeping in snatches, with the voices singing in our ears, saying that this was all folly. Then at dawn we came down to a temperate valley, wet below the snow line, smelling of vegetation, with a running stream and a watermill beating the darkness, and 3 trees on the low sky, and an old white horse galloped away in the meadow. Then we came to a tavern with vine leaves over the lintel, 6 hands at an open door dicing for pieces of silver, and feet kicking the empty wineskins. But there was no information, and so we continued and arrived at evening, not a moment too soon, finding the place. It was, you may say, satisfactory. All this was a long time ago. I remember, and I would do it again, but set down this, where we led all that way for birth or death. There was a birth, certainly, we had evidence and no doubt. I had seen birth and death, but had thought they were different. This birth was hard and bitter agony for us, like death, our death. We returned to our places, these kingdoms, but no longer at ease here in the old dispensation, with an alien people clutching their gods. I should be glad of another death.
Well, I think one of the most interesting things for me about this poem is the way that it diverges from Matthew's text of the Magi's actual journey. So, of course, Matthew's the only gospel writer who includes the Magi, but whereas in that account, they're very joyful, there's giving of the presents. In this, things are a little more somber, and I guess Eliot's presupposing that we know that story. But I noticed when I reread it this time that Herod is absent. I don't think there's a star that's mentioned, and there's not this great joy at finding the child. I wonder, what do you make of those differences or divergences?
Right. There's certainly some menace in the poem.
Mm-hmm.
And if Herod is an image of menace, remember he co-opts the Magi or magicians, or they've become 3 kings in the legend. But you go and find the infant Christ, the Messiah, and you report back and let me know, and I'll come to worship him too. And then, of course, the slaughter of the innocents unfolds, which, of course, the church just celebrated a few days after Christmas. Mm-hmm. It's interesting that note of menace is right there in the Christmas season, just a few days after the birth of the Messiah. So the church never wants to forget the threat that wants to extinguish the light.
It's not all gingerbread and eggnog.
It is not, no. Nor is our reality. Right. But yeah, interestingly, he's reading a sermon from the 1620s of Bishop Lancelot Andrews, the Bishop of Winchester, and he picks up the lines from his sermon as a way of starting this poem. The worst time of the year. Yeah, the very dead of winter. Yeah, there's no star. It's really a retrospective, isn't it?
Right.
Looking back, an old man, let's call him a king, traveler, a wise man, looking back over his life and reliving this experience of the journey and what he's learned on that journey. I'm wondering if that's something that that all of us should be doing. We don't have to wait to be old men, but we should be doing at various points in our Christian journey is looking back, reevaluating where we've, particularly this year, we've come through a very difficult journey, haven't we? Just the worst time of a year for a journey, and such a long journey 2020's been through a pandemic, right? The waves have been deep, the weather's sharp, the very dead of winter. To me, that image even speaks to us here in January of 2021, in our retrospect.
Our bleak midwinter.
Our bleak midwinter, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's pilfering from Lancelot Andrews' sermon of the 17th century, and of course he's doing the echoes on Matthew chapter 2, his story. But he's really recasting it for, in his own brilliant way.
Yeah. Yeah, I love some of these details about the difficulty of the journey, the camel men cursing and grumbling and wanting their liquor and women. It feels more contemporary, more relatable, I think, than sometimes when I read the Gospels. They feel so, I've heard them so many times, they feel like it doesn't really register the details or the little bits that do feel relatable.
But that's the poet and the dramatist and the imagery, putting there were times we regretted. I mean, we all feel that looking back. There were times we regretted. There's a lot of honesty in this poem. I mean, when you look at the context of the poem, he writes it in 1927, which is the year of his conversion to Christianity. He's baptized. So it's very much a milestone, a turning point in his own life. He's had a nervous breakdown in 1921. He married in 1915 to Vivian, and the marriage was very unhappy. And she has serious mental health problems. He's completely at loose ends. He writes The Wasteland in 1922, which is this great post-war. He's experiencing not only politically and in the social life of the time the dissolution of culture, the fragmentation of culture. By the way, they've just been through the Spanish flu, 1919, and so more people are killed, millions more in the Spanish flu than died in the First World War. And he had friends, of course, who died in the trenches of the First World War. All these people being swept away by this plague. At the same time, the complete fragmentation and dissolution of the culture that he knew and was raised in, plus his own mental health and personal collapse, plus the awfulness of his marriage. He was at complete loose ends, I think, and he's, what should he be? A Marxist or a fascist? What's the way forward here? The solution, because this whole sort of world he was raised in collapsed. And he sees Christianity as another way.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a story in a sense of his journey to this turning point. He talks about birth and death, and it is both a death in many ways for him at age 39. And we talk about baptism as a death, and then as a birth, a rebirth. And he rings the changes on that. I've seen birth, I've seen death, thought they were different, but it's a very, very personal poem for him. This is his story. And because it's the story of a Christian, it's in a sense our story.
Mm-hmm.
We're all on a journey. We call it a pilgrimage. I think Christians would call it a pilgrimage, not just a journey, but it is a journey. But it's a pilgrimage to go deeper and deeper and deeper into Christ and the love of God. But finally, his construction of the world, or you could say our construction of the world, collapsed.
Mm-hmm.
And out of the debris, he decides to choose baptism and this way forward. So this is his journey. So, yeah. Do you ever feel that way? Homecoming we had of it?
Yeah, I think just the disorientation of the past year. In a lot of ways, I came to Canada this past year, but it didn't feel like a journey in that there was such a cyclic element to time and just feeling like every day was sort of the same. I think one of the things I like about this poem is that it illustrates that sense of time going on and journey without making it seem like everything's getting better all the time or we're getting closer and closer to the thing. There's a sense of disorientation, I think, and yet hidden in this poem, it seems like, is Eliot's sense that it is worth it. There's something there. He's had a vision of something, and staying true to that vision is very difficult and disorienting, but the speaker he says it was satisfactory, which I think is an interesting kind of understatement, or there's a little bit of irony there.
Well, he's certainly underwhelmed by the place.
Mm-hmm.
In a sense, you could say the shed with the Holy Family,
mm-hmm.
the manger, was satisfactory.
Mm-hmm.
If this is a king I'm going to, arrive at. I was just going to ask you, the first third of the poem is about, it's a hard journey, and it's a hard time we had of it. And there's this voices singing in our ears, like these are the sirens, saying that this was all folly, this journey, this was all folly. I guess what I wanted to ask you was, as a young man preparing to be ordained as a priest in the church, have you had that experience that actually I'm on the wrong path, that people are telling me that this is all folly? Then why are you going to that direction? Why don't you go make some money and have fun in life and do this and that? Do you get that sometimes from friends and contemporaries, or even just you feel that way yourself, that it's not an easy path, mm-hmm. just to get to ordination, let alone to actually be serving in pastoral ministry with responsibilities? I just,
Yeah.
You're on that path.
Yeah, I'm on that journey. There aren't outer voices, I would say, besides my commissioning priest telling me that there's no money in the church and I should reconsider. But he was otherwise very encouraging. Yeah, my dad's a pastor, as you know, and growing up, I never saw myself going that direction. So I think I sort of had to do a lot of that struggle and questioning up front in deciding whether this would be what I wanted to give my life to. Yeah, so I think there's still that sense that this is all a bit, I think there's an absurdity at the heart of the gospel, and I'm sure Eliot had a sense of that, and the Magi arriving to see Christ in a manger, this is not how we expect to find God. So I think I definitely have that experience of being a bit bewildered by this journey I'm on, but I'm glad for comrades to go along with me, my wife, in the same process. Yeah.
Right. Let me just say, even after ordination, and I've been ordained for 40 years, I frequently hear those voices that this is all folly, this is all folly, this is all folly. What are you doing wasting your life at this? Mm-hmm. I find the voices don't end, that the temptations are to divert are still there. Mm-hmm. And why should that be after all these years? Well, because we're human beings, and we walk by faith. We don't have any certitude in this, do we? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think of Mother Teresa when her diaries were discovered and people learned that she'd experienced just a lot of doubt and a lot of spiritual dryness. But realizing what work she did, I think it's interesting to reframe that as a kind of faithfulness, to put up with not just exterior difficult circumstances, but also the doubts and skepticism and questions that perdure in someone's life despite prayer and all the things that the church offers. Yeah.
Yeah, he says, and I would do it again. Mm-hmm. It's almost like this was a hell of a journey. It was awful. But I would do it again. It reminds me of a young mother who's about to give birth and goes through a difficult birth process, and then is presented with her firstborn child, and of course falls in love with her child, and what Jesus even says in the gospel, that the birth pangs are quickly forgotten, right? For the joy of seeing the newborn. And it's like a mother saying, I'd do it again. I would do it again. Mm-hmm. But it was a hard journey.
Yeah, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the birth-death that preoccupies that last stanza. I think you mentioned to me a few weeks ago just that question of, I should be glad of another death. Well, what death is that?
Well, I think it's a poem of Epiphany. So Epiphany means revelation, manifestation, aha. I guess we've all had aha moments that sort of make things suddenly clear to us. Mm-hmm. This very hard death. It's about, this death is first of all a disillusioning, I think. Here's Eliot, disillusioned with his culture, post-war culture, disillusioned with the leadership, disillusioned with himself. With all the brilliance and opportunities of his upbringing and his Harvard education disillusioned with his marriage, utterly dispirited and disillusioned. There's a kind of death in accepting that loss. But it's also a discernment, I think, of what to put your faith in. And all that he put his faith in, he relinquishes and lets go of. And so there's a death. And for him, that's enacted sacramentally in being baptized at the age of 39. This death-birth paradox is all through the Gospels, isn't it? I mean, Nicodemus, how can I be born again now that I'm old? I think our Christian journey is, we're always being asked to put things to death so that something important, better can be born.
Without necessarily knowing what that will look like.
Yeah, that makes it so scary, doesn't it? Yep. I think the disillusionment comes, suddenly you don't feel at home anymore. And certainly Eliot felt like an alien resident of his culture and of his times. He was part of the Bloomsbury crowd, but he never felt part of that at all. So he was alienated on so many levels. And here's the old king says, we return to home by another road, I guess, these kingdoms that we came from, but no longer at ease here in the old dispensation and what was old and familiar. I wonder whether we will say that at the end of 2021, after this whole pandemic thing. You're a young man, you're going to tell your children and grandchildren, I knew a pre-pandemic world and the post-pandemic world, that kind of marker, like I went through the Depression, or I went through the Second War, or I lived through the Spanish flu. It's a kind of marker. And here's these people saying they can't go back to the old dispensation. I wonder whether our world can go back to what we all thought was the norm and familiar and customary.
Right,
and politics has changed. Pandemics changed everything.
I think, one of the things that this time has given us is a way of re-seeing what we took to be normal. I think of a comment that one of my friends made. He said that after the pandemic, people are gonna, just like go into a coffee shop and order a coffee, and someone will just like start crying because that sense of returning and gives us a sense of the weight of it and the wonderfulness of ordinary life that we didn't have before. Of course, at tremendous cost. But I think that's kind of an epiphany element to it too.
Don't you think there's a reevaluation going on by many people about the culture that we have inhabited, and then what we've had opportunity in this time to really rethink? And many people will no longer be at ease here in the old dispensation and the way things were, right? And an alien people clutching their gods. Which gods have we been clutching? Which idols, which we've had to let go of in this pandemic time? And I think for a lot of people, we're not going to go back to clutching those same idols. There's a whole reevaluation, you could call it repentance, going on as a society and as individuals. This has been, for better or for worse, it's been a hard blessing, but it's been an epiphany. It's shone a light on our society, perhaps on our lives, in a way that we didn't welcome, but it certainly illumined some things.
Yeah. I think for me, one of the interesting things has been just how much our safety and health depend on people we don't know and on strangers, and just realizing how interconnected we are, not just in like a digital sense, but in a very tangible, like my good depends on your protection from the virus, and same goes the other way. So yeah, I think I'm hoping that that'll help us rethink as a society how we value and protect those people who are most vulnerable to things like this. But certainly a reckoning.
Yeah, and maybe an epiphany about the common good.
Mm-hmm.
Once again, rethinking what that means as a society.
Yeah. I think you had a bit from W.H. Auden that you were going to share?
Yeah, I was just going to share, Auden was a younger generation, but certainly one of the most distinguished poets of the 20th century. And Eliot employed Auden at Faber and Faber in the early 30s. But this is a poem that Auden wrote in the Second World War, again about 15 years after Eliot's poem, but again the world is falling apart. And again, Auden chooses the Magi story. Again, I just wanted to quote this. He says, "At least we know for certain that we are three old sinners, that this journey is much too long, that we want our dinners and miss our wives, our dogs, our books, but have only the vaguest idea why we are what we are. To discover how to be human now is the reason we follow the star." To discover how to be human is the reason we follow the star.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. For many of us, the human journey feels way too long, way too hard, way too frustrating, particularly this year when we're all locked down. But we just want our dinners, our wives, our dogs, our screens, our Netflix. And as long as we can kind of cocoon comfortably in our carefully curated, customized identities, we're fine. So Auden is mocking us and our vision of humanity, I guess. But I like that. To discover how to be human now is the reason we follow the star.
Mm-hmm. And why they come to look at this child who will teach them to be human. Yeah, I think that captures some of the absurdity or paradox of the Christmas story and of Epiphany. Yeah. Well, I think we'll wrap things up there. Thank you, Peter.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And tune in next week for another conversation. Take care.